What do children do in the spiritual garden? An empirical study of pupils' engagement with reflection space in 10 church primary schools. The present pandemic has highlighted a critical need to attend to the spiritual well-being of young people. Many primary schools have addressed this need by developing imaginative spaces for reflection in classroom and outdoor areas. This presentation looks at how children interpret and use the outdoor spiritual spaces to benefit their spiritual well-being. The data is drawn from the Faith in the Nexus project, an empirical mixed methods research study undertaken by the National Institute for Christian Education Research in Canterbury Christ Church University. The findings revealed children's explanations of how and why they use spiritual gardens and how they integrate reflection practices encountered in school into the home. An analysis of this engagement illuminates children's understanding and valuing of spiritual practices. Finally, the discussion argues for the value of such spaces in all schools, not only those of a religious character. The presentation concludes with a glimpse of innovative Nexus resources developed to disseminate the research findings and encourage schools to facilitate spiritual gardens in all schools. Spiritual well-being. The pandemic has meant that an encounter with loss on various levels has impacted the lives of young people on a vast scale. As a result, there have been widespread concerns about the potential impact of the coronavirus pandemic on children's mental health and spiritual well-being. However, even before the recent COVID pandemic, church primary schools in England provided spaces in school for children to reflect. Providing opportunities for reflection, contemplating and questioning is an essential process that can help restore hope and well-being in the shadow of loss. Looking at how church primary schools children understand and use these spaces provides evidence of the benefit for children's spiritual well-being. Children as spiritual beings. Two fundamental assumptions underpin this study. Firstly, we are all spiritual beings. Secondly, the child is an active agent in their spiritual development. Spirituality is innate. As Lisa Miller points out, young children don't have to learn the how or the what of spiritual engagement. All of nature speaks to them and they respond. Children are born fully fluent in this primal non-verbal dimension of knowing. Thus, children are active participants in religious socialization. They are not passive recipients of parental influences. Susan Ridgely argues that children are co-creators of religious traditions. Children's experience and expression of religious traditions are different to adults. The same applies to children's experience of spirituality. Children are not passive recipients of spiritual wisdom, but are sensitive and relational beings, active participants in their own existence. Children's spirituality should neither be viewed as a childlike version that will be outgrown, nor an adult-like expression of spirituality. It is different, not weaker or lesser. Methodology. This paper focuses on 10 church primary schools with spiritual gardens. The schools formed part of the Faith in the Nexus research study, an empirical mixed methods research study that investigated how 20 English church primary schools, Church of England and Catholic, facilitated opportunities to explore faith or spiritual dimension at home. The research involved 454 focus group interviewees and 1,002 respondents to an online survey. The analysis of focus group interviews with children aged 10 to 11 years in 10 of the church primary schools forms the basis of this paper. The schools were all church schools, 7 Church of England, 2 Catholic and 1 interdenominational. They were in a variety of settings, urban to small rural village schools. The interview questions were open-ended. What happens in school or home which helps you explore faith or spiritual things? However, definitions were left deliberately vague for the children to interpret as they saw fit. Analysis of the interviews was aided by NVivo 12 software, Transcriptions were coded and themes identified as they emerged. Research findings. The findings revealed children's explanations of how and why they use spiritual gardens and how they integrate reflection practices encountered in school into the home. The 10 church primary schools all had a designated space outside referred to as a spiritual, reflection, quiet, prayer or secret garden. The importance of these spaces emerged when, in response to the question, where would be the first place you would take a visitor to your school, children responded with the spiritual garden. I would take them to the spiritual garden because that's where people would rest. I would go to the spiritual garden because you can. If something bad goes on, you can just pray. What did children say they do in a spiritual garden? Children interpreted the function of spiritual gardens in various ways as quiet spaces, prayer and worship spaces, reflection spaces, and being in nature. Let's consider one example from a small rural church school in the English countryside. The children described the garden in their school. They drew attention to the central feature of the garden, a chimney pot in which they could place a stone, and you make a wish. Another child explained the same feature in more religious terms. We've made a little wooden cross that just stands next to our chimney, because when you put the stone in, apparently your prayers will go up to God, like smoke coming out. Also in the garden were a tree and a fence on which the children could tie ribbons. One child explained that you write a hope you wish for on a ribbon and hang it up on the tree. On the fence, the ribbons were to remember people, like poppies, and you write on a red ribbon and tie it to the fence. Integral to the children's description of the physical environment was why they used it. For example, for several, it was a quiet space to be alone. You can just go if you want to be by yourself, to pray or something. As you can see on the PowerPoint, for others, it was a place to go if you were angry or sad. It was interesting to note how many of the pupils in this church primary described spending time in the garden as an opportunity to talk to God. The garden was very much owned by the children. A pupil council was responsible for managing these areas. As one pupil explained, they had spiritual garden guardians who looked after the garden. Pupils' sense of ownership and responsibility for these areas was common in all the schools. Pupils contributed to these spaces' design and had clear ideas of what was needed to make the space a spiritual garden. It had to be a quiet space, a space where children could sit, which pupils could access when they needed it. For many, there also had to be an interactive element. For example, a box where you could put prayers or pebbles that could be rearranged. If we look at children's interpretations of spiritual gardens across all 10 schools, 4 themes emerged. Spiritual gardens were spaces for stress relief, a place of reflection on personal worries or wider concerns, a space to be in nature, and for some, a space to speak to God. A calming, quiet space in a busy environment. The spiritual garden was seen as an oasis of quiet in a busy school environment. Pupils were insistent that the reflection spaces had to be quiet and were intolerant of pupils who did not respect this. For many children, they provided a space in school where they could sit in peace, just rest and think. For some, it was seen as a place to go when you were stressed or feeling angry. As one child explained, the spiritual garden is where, if you're all angry and you don't want to find somebody, you would go to the spiritual garden and you'd rest in peace. The importance of this quiet space for the children could not be underestimated and was echoed when children spoke of what they did at home. They sought out quiet spaces at home, which for many seemed a rare opportunity to be alone to think. Reflecting on worries and concerns. The spiritual garden was also a place children went to when they were sad, concerned about the ill health or death of relatives, pets, or others in the community. As one pupil explained, it was the place he went to when his cat died. Others spoke about worries about grandparents. For some pupils, the concerns reflected wider issues discussed in school, such as, I would go into the reflective garden to think about how lucky I am, and how would the refugees sleep when it was raining at night? Pupils modelled spaces at home on the reflection spaces in the school. One pupil spoke of how he had designed his rabbit's grave like the garden in the school. Being in nature, many pupils drew attention to the natural world of these gardens. They described the sight and smells of the plants and the insect life, as can be seen in the quotes on the screen. God, He made all our senses to be used for every single different task, so why let them go to waste when we could use them to loop back to God? I usually just like the nature that's around. It's such a wild place, and it's mainly nature that calms you down when you go and hear nature and see all the fascinating things, like you might see another type of bug. It's like, wow, I've never seen that before. For some, being in these spaces raised awareness of the natural world. Some pupils moved quickly from descriptions of the time in the spiritual garden to telling about time spent reflecting in nature, on the beach, in the park, in the woods, or on walks with their family. A sacred space. The school leadership often emphasised the spiritual or religious aspect of the garden. Religious symbols such as crosses were placed in the garden. In some schools, the space was large enough for collective worship. As one pupil explained, when we do class worship, sometimes we go out to the prayer garden, and for me personally, it's a great way for me to reflect on what I've done. In 2 schools, the garden was used in particular to remember those who have died. One head stated that they first made the garden after the death of a pupil. For pupils, the religious or spiritual side was interpreted as the garden being a space where you could talk to God, ask Him for things, or thank Him. Discussion. An analysis of pupils' interpretation of these spaces reveals 3 key themes: child-led space, sense of being in nature, and space for spiritual well-being. Child-led space. The Nexus research reveals that children actively seek out times to think and reflect, and as adults, we need to respect this space. Rebecca Nye points out that it is all too easy to bring an adult imposing or controlling presence to these precious moments. Consciously giving children space and letting their creativity and independent thinking shine through sets the foundations for them to grow stronger in their spiritual life. When the opportunity arose, children expressed ownership of these spaces and readily volunteered to oversee them. They valued having the lead on the design and creation of their reflection space and had thought very seriously about it. Although adult guidance was apparent, it was not overpowering or intrusive. Recognising the importance of their role as leaders in creating these spaces appeals to children's connection and engagement with them. Reflection in nature. Reflection outdoors was common in many of the participating schools. Having time to reflect when outside in the natural environment, whether when walking outside in the woods or on the beach or sitting in the spiritual garden, was emphasised by many children involved with the Nexus project. Drawing upon Froebel's early thinking on childhood, he argued that encouraging children to spend time outdoors in the natural environment is good for them. It engenders the sense of awe and wonder. For many children in the Nexus project, being outside and connecting with nature gave them a sense of calm. Spiritual well-being. Much of the Nexus research findings about spiritual well-being resonates with the thinking of others. Children expressing how they use the spiritual garden echoes Hay and Nye's 4 areas: self, others, world and God. Spiritual gardens can provide space for reflection, thinking and praying. They can give a child the sense of stepping away from the everyday distractions of modern life and stepping into a dimension of inward, outward and upward thinking. An emerging theme in our research was children's need for solitude that allows them time to reflect on their experiences. Never has it been more prevalent for children to have such opportunities than at this time with the coronavirus crisis. What matters is for young people to have respected space and what Nye calls child-led spiritual listening without judgment or agenda. Further analysis is needed into how these pupils viewed these spaces as spiritual and the influence of the different schools' Christian ethos on the different religious and spiritual interpretations of the space. Nevertheless, 3 conclusions can be drawn from this analysis. 1. Children seek out spiritual space in school and at home, particularly when they are sad, angry, or need to be alone. 2. Spiritual gardens in school provide a space for children to have a time of quiet, of reflection, a space that they rarely find elsewhere in their lives. And 3. Children perceive that spiritual gardens are beneficial for their spiritual well-being. These findings need to inform provision of such opportunities for children in all school settings, and perhaps also within the home environment and in the faith community. Recommendations. This research has highlighted the importance of outdoor spaces in schools for children's spiritual well-being. To further disseminate these findings, we have produced resources for schools and churches. The full complement can be found on nisa.org.uk. The Nexus resource on reflection spaces is one example we wish to share with you, as this offers a glimpse into the research and helps in establishing a spiritual garden in your area. How to establish spiritual spaces in schools. Always remember, this garden's primary users are the children. What adults might want in the space may be completely different and probably a lot neater. Do not let the adult's voice dominate the planning process. Make sure all 5 senses are involved. Children are more conscious of smell than adults. As the research highlighted, let the children influence the design. Ask them what they would like to see within the space. Do remember, this must affirm those of all faiths and none. Useful practical advice includes: develop a working party that consists of families and children. If you are in a church school, ask for help from the local church. All communities have gardeners, and they are usually willing to share expertise and will probably donate plants. This is a fantastic opportunity for older folk to engage with school children in a significant way, especially for children whose grandparents are geographically distant. Do note, however, that all safeguarding requirements must be met. Identify available space. Think about what already grows here. Trees can be included and provide shade and a source of wonder. What sort of plants like this type of soil? What animals might live in this area because of the trees? Consider the balance of plants. How will you attract wildlife into the space to facilitate awe and wonder moments? Seek local help. Use local diocesan or council advisors to network with others who have developed such a space locally and ask them about contractors, planning, suppliers. Ask school families for help. If the garden includes the chance to donate memorial plants, many families will own the space and use it.